You know, they say betrayal doesn't always come from your enemies, it comes from the people you love the most. I never thought I'd be the kind of man posting my life story on Reddit, but here I am. I guess when the weight of something this massive sits on your chest, you need to let it out somewhere. I'll start at the beginning, though I promise you, this isn't just another "they cheated, I'm hurt" story. No, this goes much, much deeper. My name's Mark. I'm 52, and for the last 25 years, I've been married to Sarah. We had what I thought was a good marriage. Comfortable, supportive, maybe a little stale after all these years, but still solid. We also have a daughter, Emily. She's 24, smart, kind-hearted, and everything a father could hope for. Emily got married 2 years ago to a guy named Jake. On the surface, Jake seemed perfect, charming, ambitious, and the kind of man who could light up a room with his smile. Looking back now, I hate that smile. The day everything fell apart was a cold Tuesday evening. Emily showed up at our house unannounced, pale as a ghost and clutching her phone in trembling hands. She had been crying. Sarah wasn't home, she said she had a work dinner. Emily didn't even have to speak, she just handed me her phone. On the screen were messages. Hundreds of them. Explicit, emotional, undeniable. My wife. Her husband. My daughter's husband. The two people who were supposed to be Emily's rocks, her mother and her husband, were tearing her world apart behind closed doors. Emily collapsed into my arms, sobbing so hard I thought she'd break. I held her, numb and silent, while my mind raced. Disbelief turned into anger. Anger turned into something colder. They have no idea I know, Emily whispered against my chest. And just like that, the seed of revenge was planted. I told Emily to leave everything to me. To act normal, to not confront Jake or Sarah yet. I promised her that we would handle this, together. I'm not proud to admit this, but I'm a methodical man. When I'm hurt, I don't lash out. I plan. And oh, I was going to plan something so perfectly devastating that neither of them would see it coming. But first, I needed proof. Undeniable, irrefutable proof. Over the next 2 weeks, Emily played her part brilliantly. She smiled at Jake, she hugged her mother, and she laughed at their jokes. But every time she looked at me, I could see the fire behind her eyes, the same fire that was burning inside me. Meanwhile, I got to work. I hired a private investigator. Some people might think that's overkill, but I wanted everything: photos, recordings, timestamps. If I was going to do this, I was going to do it right. It didn't take long. Within days, I had photos of Sarah and Jake at a hotel, holding hands at restaurants, and even sharing moments in public where they thought no one was watching. But the worst was the recording. The investigator had managed to plant a small device in Sarah's car. One night, as I sat in my office with headphones on, I listened to them laughing, flirting, planning a future together. "He'll never know, Sarah. Mark trusts you completely." Trust. What a fragile, stupid thing. I could feel my pulse pounding in my temples as I listened. When the recording ended, I sat in silence for nearly an hour. My hands were trembling, but not from sadness. From clarity. It was time to act. But here's the thing, you can't just confront people like this. If you want revenge to truly sting, you have to make them comfortable first. You have to let them think they've won. So I started laying the groundwork. I planned a family dinner, something we hadn't done in months. Sarah was overjoyed. Jake looked nervous, but he played along. Emily, bless her heart, acted like nothing was wrong. As I sat across from them at the dinner table that night, watching them laugh and joke, something in me shifted. I wasn't sad anymore. I wasn't even angry. I was cold. And that's when I realized, I wasn't just going to expose them. I was going to destroy them. But the trick with revenge, dear reader, is patience. And I had all the time in the world. I've always believed that if you want to trap someone, you need to give them a little rope. You see, revenge isn't about rushing in with guns blazing. No. It's about getting everything lined up perfectly, and then watching the trap snap shut at just the right moment. The family dinner had been a perfect first step. Sarah, for all her cunning, had no idea what was coming. She thought I was oblivious, that I had no clue what was happening behind the scenes. The look of relief in her eyes as she smiled at me, oh, it almost made me feel bad for her. Almost. But I didn't rush. I let her think she was in control. I let Jake think he could keep playing his part, and Emily, despite the pain she was going through, played the role of the dutiful daughter, just as I asked her to. That week I went to work. I started manipulating little things. I didn't want Sarah to catch on too quickly, but I needed her to feel a sense of security before I pulled the rug out from under her. So, I began sowing seeds of doubt in her mind. I would come home from work and act a little distant, but not enough to raise alarm. I made sure Sarah noticed. Sometimes, I'd disappear for hours, no reason, just to get her thinking. She hated it. She couldn't stand not knowing where I was. She'd ask, but I'd just smile and say I was taking care of some business. I could see her eyes narrow. She was becoming suspicious, and I wanted that. Suspicion breeds paranoia. Meanwhile, Emily and I kept our cool. Emily had a plan of her own. While she pretended to be fine, I encouraged her to gather her own ammunition. If Sarah thought Emily was still the daughter she knew and loved, it would make everything so much sweeter when the time came. One night, after Sarah had gone to bed, I got a call from Emily. "Dad, I think I've got something." I sat up straight. "What do you mean?" Emily's voice was barely above a whisper. "I've been following Jake for the past few days. I wanted to see if he'd do something stupid." My heart pounded in my chest. I knew what she meant. "Go on." "He's been meeting someone." "Not just anyone, Dad. It's the same woman every time. I followed them to a motel last night. I got pictures." I leaned back in my chair, feeling the rush of adrenaline. I hadn't asked her to do this, but she had done it anyway. She was becoming as cold and calculating as I was. "Good job," I said. "Send them to me." It wasn't just that Emily had gathered more proof. It was the fact that Jake had been so careless. He thought he was untouchable. He thought he could keep up the charade. And in that moment I knew that Sarah and Jake were about to fall into my trap, and there was no way out for them. For the next few weeks, I continued to play my part. I made sure to keep Sarah and Jake on edge, but not too much. I needed them to keep thinking they had control. I still went through the motions, pretending to be the husband who had no idea. But I was watching. Always watching. And one night, the opportunity presented itself. I had invited Sarah's family over for a casual get-together, and of course, Jake was there, acting like the doting son-in-law. Emily played her role perfectly, feigning happiness as she smiled through the evening. I could see the tension in the air, but no one else could. They were all blind to what was about to unfold. After dinner, as everyone was settling into the living room for coffee, I made my move. I excused myself from the conversation and headed upstairs to my office. There, I pulled out the pictures Emily had sent me and began preparing. My plan was simple but effective. I had been planting little clues, misplaced messages, odd conversations, that would eventually lead to a confrontation. The last piece of the puzzle was the phone call. I made sure Sarah would pick up the phone when it rang. The number was unlisted, but the voice on the other end was unmistakable. It was Jake's voice, and he was saying things he shouldn't have been. "I'm going to leave her soon, Sarah. She's getting too clingy. I think she suspects something." I knew Sarah would panic. I knew she'd think it was a threat to their little affair, and that would make her slip up. And sure enough, when she picked up the phone, I saw it. Her face went pale, her hands shaking as she tried to hide her panic. But it was too late. She was already in the web, and the harder she tried to escape, the tighter the strands of my plan became. I waited. She hung up the phone, and I could see the dread settling in. Jake's betrayal had started to feel real to her. But she didn't know how deep the hole she'd dug truly was. At that moment, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: satisfaction. But that was just the beginning. At this point, I had built the perfect house of cards, and it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. But patience was key. As much as I wanted to confront them, expose the truth, and let the pieces fall where they may, I knew I had to wait. I needed to make sure they both felt secure enough in their actions to make the mistake that would seal their fates. Sarah's anxiety had already started to show. I could see it in the way she acted around me. A little too kind. A little too eager to please. She knew I was different now. She could feel it. But she didn't know why. She didn't know what I knew. Jake, on the other hand, continued with his act. He had no clue that I had started weaving the strands of his undoing. Every time I saw him, I could barely keep the disgust off my face, but I kept my composure. His cocky smile, his confident swagger, everything about him made me want to rip the mask off and expose him for what he truly was. But I didn't. Not yet. I could see Emily growing more impatient by the day. I reassured her that the plan would work. We had to let things unfold naturally. She didn't quite understand at first, but I kept telling her that the longer they thought they were getting away with it, the harder they would fall when the truth came out. And I knew, when it happened, it would be catastrophic. As weeks passed, Emily and I continued to play our parts. We made sure Sarah and Jake stayed comfortable, even though they were walking on a razor's edge. It was like watching two rats scurry around, unaware of the trap that was slowly, deliberately being set for them. But then came the night I'd been waiting for. I had called Sarah into the living room for a talk. I had noticed her acting a little strange the past couple of days, and I figured it was time to nudge her toward the precipice. I needed to watch her squirm, to see how far she'd go before the truth finally hit her. When she walked into the room, I could tell she was already on edge. She looked at me, her eyes wide, trying to gauge what I was thinking. "Mark," she said, her voice unnaturally calm. "What's this about?" I could see the flicker of worry in her eyes. She was trying to stay composed, but I knew she was falling apart inside. The constant fear of getting caught was eating at her. And I had to admit, watching her unravel was a twisted form of pleasure for me. "I just wanted to talk," I said, keeping my tone cool and collected. I had perfected the art of acting like nothing was wrong. She had no idea what was coming. She crossed her arms, her posture defensive. "About what?" I took a deep breath, my mind racing as I played out the next few moments in my head. "I've been thinking," I said slowly, letting the tension build. "About us. About you and me." Her eyes narrowed. She was trying to figure out where I was going with this. She had no idea that I already knew everything. "I think we need some space," I said, watching her face shift in confusion. "I think it's time for us to take a break." The words hit her like a slap. Her eyes darted around, trying to find something to hold on to. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. She was scrambling to figure out what I was talking about. "What do you mean, a break?" she finally managed. I smiled, a cold, detached smile. "You're not fooling me, Sarah." Her breath caught in her throat. The color drained from her face, and she took a step back. "What are you talking about?" I stood up, walking toward her. I wasn't going to give her an inch. Not anymore. "You think I don't know? You think I don't know about you and Jake?" Her face twisted with panic, and I could see the mask of control starting to crack. She was caught. And for a moment, I let the silence hang between us, letting the truth sink in. "Mark," she whispered, her voice trembling. I don't know what you're talking about." I leaned in, my voice low and menacing. "Oh, I think you do. I've seen the messages. I've heard the recordings. I know everything." Her lips quivered as she looked at me, eyes wide with fear. She opened her mouth to say something, but nothing came out. "I want you to understand something, Sarah," I continued, my voice ice cold. "I'm not angry. I'm not upset. I'm not even hurt. I'm just done." Her shoulders slumped. She looked defeated, and that was exactly what I wanted. I wanted her to understand that she was no longer in control. She wasn't going to walk away from this unscathed. But the real surprise was yet to come. As Sarah stood there, speechless, I turned and looked at the doorway. Emily was standing there, a hard look on her face. She stepped into the room, her presence like a storm cloud rolling in. "You think you can betray Dad and get away with it, don't you, Mom?" Emily's voice was steady, but there was a fire in her eyes. I could see the fear in Sarah's face as she realized her daughter was part of this plan. But there was something else, something colder. Emily walked over to me, standing by my side, and we both looked at Sarah. "You've made your bed, Mom," Emily said quietly. "Now you'll lie in it." I watched as Sarah's expression morphed from fear to fury. But the fury wasn't for me. It was for Emily. She finally understood that her own daughter had turned against her. And that's when I knew, the moment I'd been waiting for was finally here. You know that moment when the reality hits? When everything you thought you knew crumbles around you, and you're left standing there, staring at the shattered pieces of your life. That was Sarah's moment. I'll admit it, it felt good. Watching her struggle to process what was happening. Watching her realize that her whole world was coming down, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. But Emily, oh, she was a different story. For all the years she'd lived under her mother's roof, she had always been the good daughter, the sweet one, the one who followed the rules. But in that moment, I saw the same cold determination in her eyes that I had in mine. The apple didn't fall far from the tree, and I could see that Emily was enjoying this. "Dad, I think it's time we showed Mom the full picture," Emily said, her voice calm, but there was an edge to it. I nodded. Sarah had been staring at us both, trying to make sense of everything, but she was out of her depth now. "Emily, you can't," she started, but the words died in her throat. "Can't what?" Emily interrupted, stepping forward. "Can't do what? Expose you? You're the one who chose to destroy this family." Her words hung in the air, and I could see Sarah's face twisting with a mixture of rage and desperation. The woman who had once seemed so sure of herself, so confident, was now a broken shell. "Emily, please," Sarah begged, her voice cracking. I never meant to hurt you. I was just trying to find something for myself." "Something for yourself?" Emily repeated, her voice sharp. "Is that what you call it? Sleeping with my husband behind my back? Do you have any idea what that's done to me? What it's done to Dad?" I could feel the tension in the room tightening. I could see Sarah trying to regain her composure, but the cracks were there. She couldn't hold the facade anymore. She was unraveling, and there was no way to put it back together. I watched her falter. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. It just happened." Just happened. How many times had I heard that excuse? How many times had I heard that from people who thought they could escape the consequences of their actions? It was weak. Pathetic. And I wasn't going to let her hide behind it. "Sarah," I said, my voice low and steady, "you don't get to make excuses. You've destroyed this family, and now, you'll have to live with the consequences." The silence in the room was suffocating. Sarah took a step back, her hands trembling, her face pale. I could see her desperately searching for a way out, but there was none. She had no more cards to play. And then, just as Sarah seemed to be on the verge of breaking, I pulled out the final piece of the puzzle. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the flash drive. It was small, unassuming, but it held everything. Every message, every picture, every recording. "I think you'll want to see this," I said, my eyes never leaving her face. I plugged the drive into the TV and watched as the screen flickered to life. The first image was Sarah and Jake at a restaurant, their hands intertwined, their faces full of secrets. Then came the pictures of them at the hotel, their smiles, their whispers, their lies captured in full detail. But it was the recordings that hit hardest. "I can't believe you're doing this to him, Sarah. I don't know how much longer I can keep up the act." That was Jake's voice, clear as day. And it wasn't just one recording. There were several. Him talking about their plans, their future together. All of it laid bare for Sarah to see. I watched her face as the reality of it all sank in. She was no longer the woman who had controlled the narrative, who had played everyone. No, now she was just a woman exposed. "Mark, please," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "You wanted to destroy this family for a fling," I said, cutting her off. "Well, now I'm going to make sure you lose everything." The room felt heavy. Emily stood there beside me, her expression unreadable, but I could see the flicker of something behind her eyes. A sense of victory. "You're not going to get away with this, Mom," Emily said, her voice quiet but resolute. I turned to Emily and placed a hand on her shoulder. "We're not doing this to hurt her," I said, my voice cold. "We're doing this to make sure she understands the cost of betrayal." Sarah looked between us, her eyes wide with fear. But there was no sympathy in my heart. I had no intention of sparing her. I had given her a chance to come clean, a chance to take responsibility. But instead, she had chosen to lie, to manipulate, to hurt the people who loved her. And now, she would pay the price. "You'll never get away with this," Sarah whispered again, her voice trembling. But I wasn't concerned about her threats. She had already lost. The final nail in the coffin had been hammered into place, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. "I don't need to get away with anything," I said, my voice calm. "The truth speaks for itself." And with that I turned off the TV, unplugged the flash drive, and placed it on the table in front of her. "Take it. This is what you've earned," I said, my voice cold. The last thing I saw before I left the room was Sarah's face, pale and hollow. I could see the despair in her eyes. She knew her life had just crumbled. But Emily and I, we were calm. We were cold. We had won. When I left that room, leaving Sarah alone with the flash drive and the weight of everything she had just learned, there was a strange sense of finality. A part of me felt vindicated, sure, but another part, a colder, more detached part of me, wondered just how much farther I could take this. Would I feel better when it was all over? Would the pain, the anger, the years of betrayal, finally be washed away by the sheer satisfaction of revenge? Or would I end up as broken as she was? But there was no going back. I had come this far, and there was no way to retreat now. Sarah's life had already been flipped upside down, but Jake hadn't even begun to feel the sting yet. I glanced over at Emily, who had been silent for most of the exchange. She had taken in everything with a stoic calmness, but I could see it in her eyes. She was waiting for the next step. "You did well," I told her, my voice low. Emily nodded but didn't respond. She didn't need to. We were on the same page now. We were both playing the long game, and we both knew that the worst was yet to come. The next few days were excruciating in their silence. After the confrontation, Sarah barely left the house. She spent her days locked in her bedroom, avoiding everyone. Jake, meanwhile, had gone completely radio silent. No phone calls, no texts. The silence spoke volumes. I wasn't sure if he was scared or just unsure about how to handle the fallout. Either way, I wasn't concerned. The truth would eventually reach him, and when it did, I knew he wouldn't be able to handle it. One evening, as I sat at the dinner table, I got a call from Emily. "It's done," she said, her voice calm. "Jake's here." I leaned back in my chair, feeling a strange sense of anticipation. "What's he doing here?" "He's not here to apologize," she said. "He's here to beg for forgiveness." I didn't respond immediately. Part of me felt the urge to laugh, but I kept my composure. It wasn't about laughter. It was about control. "Keep him there. I'll be right over." I arrived at Emily's apartment a short while later. She had Jake in the living room, pacing back and forth, clearly agitated. When he saw me, he froze. His eyes darted from me to Emily and back to me, and for a moment, I could see the panic in his eyes. "Mark," Jake said, trying to sound calm, but his voice was trembling. "We need to talk." I crossed my arms and leaned against the doorframe. "Talk? About what, Jake? About how you've been sleeping with my wife behind my back? About how you've been playing me for a fool?" Jake's face flushed with guilt, and he took a step forward. Listen, I never meant for things to go this far. It just happened. Sarah and I. Just happened? I interrupted, my voice dangerously low. Is that what you're telling me? It just happened? You've been sneaking around with my wife for months, and you think I'm going to buy that excuse? Emily stood behind me, her arms crossed. She was a spectator now, watching the final act of the show unfold. But I could see the fire in her eyes. She wasn't just watching, she was relishing this. I'm sorry, man, Jake said, desperation creeping into his voice. I messed up. I was weak, and You're sorry? I laughed, the sound cold and hollow. Sorry doesn't cut it, Jake. You don't get to waltz in here and beg for forgiveness. You've ruined everything. You've destroyed my family. And now, I'm going to make sure you feel every ounce of pain you've caused. Jake's eyes widened. What do you mean by that? I stepped forward, my gaze fixed on him. You think you can walk away from this? Think again. I've got everything I need to destroy your life, just like you did to mine. But don't worry, I'm not going to do it all at once. I'm going to make sure you suffer, just like you made me suffer. Jake took a step back, clearly shaken. You can't do this, Mark. You don't understand. I didn't want any of this. It just happened. You keep saying that, I said, my voice laced with venom. But the truth is, you made a choice. You chose to betray me. You chose to betray my daughter, and now you're going to pay the price. I turned to Emily, who was watching Jake with cold, calculating eyes. I think it's time we show him just how far we're willing to go. Emily stepped forward, her voice soft but filled with cold determination. Jake, you have no idea what's coming. You think you can fix this by apologizing? That's adorable. Jake looked between the two of us, his panic growing. What do you mean? Emily reached into her purse and pulled out her phone, opening up a video file. She handed it to Jake, her eyes never leaving his. This is what's coming for you, she said, a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. Jake took the phone from her hand, his eyes scanning the screen. His face drained of color as he watched the video, a video of him and Sarah, laughing and talking about their future together, unaware that they were being recorded. I watched as Jake's face twisted in horror. He knew what it meant. He knew this video would be the death knell of everything he had worked for. You're dead, Jake, I said, my voice colder than ice. You and Sarah both. You've got nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The moment you thought you could get away with this was the moment I set the trap. Jake dropped the phone, his face a mask of terror. Please, Mark, he begged, his voice cracking. Please, I'll do anything. I'll fix this. I'll make it right. You can't fix what's already broken, I said, stepping closer. And now you're going to learn the true meaning of betrayal. Emily's face softened for a brief moment, but her eyes never left Jake. This is just the beginning, she whispered. And with those words I knew it was time to make the next move. The atmosphere in the room felt suffocating, the tension nearly palpable. Jake was on the edge of a complete breakdown, his eyes darting between me, Emily, and the phone he had dropped on the floor. He hadn't expected this. He thought he was coming in for a simple apology, maybe some desperate attempt at salvaging whatever he could from the wreckage. But now, he was trapped. The trap had been set perfectly, and the noose was tightening around his neck. You think you can crawl your way out of this, Jake? I asked, my voice cold. I took a slow step forward, my eyes never leaving his. There's no going back now. You've already crossed the line. You've made your bed, and now it's time to lie in it. Jake's breathing was shallow, panic evident in every shaky exhale. I didn't mean for it to happen this way, he said, pleading now, his voice breaking. I'm sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. Sorry? Emily repeated, her tone sharp and unforgiving. You're not sorry, Jake. You're sorry you got caught. That's all this is. I turned to Emily, giving her a nod. She stepped aside and reached for her phone again. This time, when she handed it to Jake, I saw his face twist with something else entirely, desperation mixed with dread. He wasn't going to like what he was about to see. "Look at this," she told him, her voice still calm but carrying the weight of someone who had long since given up on compassion for him. The screen flickered to life. It wasn't just a video anymore. It was a recording of a phone conversation between Sarah and Jake. I had taken a lot of time collecting evidence, getting the pieces I needed, and I'd put them together in a way that would break them both beyond repair. This wasn't just about ruining their relationship. It was about destroying their lives. In the recording, Sarah's voice was low and seductive, as she whispered about their plans for the future. The two of them had been talking openly, unaware that I had someone watching them, someone loyal to me who had given me access to their private conversations. They talked about leaving everything behind, about how Jake would get his share of the family wealth once I was out of the picture, and how Sarah had planned to manipulate her daughter to avoid suspicion. I could see Jake's eyes widening as he listened. I didn't need to say a word. He was already reeling from the realization that everything was on the table now. He had thought he could play the game, manipulate both Sarah and me, without consequences. "Did you think you could just run off with her and everything would be fine?" I asked, my voice rising with a mix of anger and incredulity. "You didn't think I'd ever find out? You didn't think you'd leave a trail?" Jake's body trembled, and I saw a flicker of panic in his eyes. He tried to speak, but nothing came out. He was paralyzed by the weight of the evidence, the recordings, the undeniable proof of his betrayal. His hands were shaking, and his mouth was dry. "You think this is just going to blow over?" Emily pressed, her eyes narrowing. "You think we'll let you just walk away? After everything you've done?" Jake staggered back, his back hitting the wall, as if he wanted to retreat from us but couldn't. "I don't know what you want from me," he cried, his voice breaking under the pressure. "I want you to understand the full extent of your mistake," I said, stepping closer, my voice dark and deliberate. "I want you to understand that everything you thought you knew, everything you thought you had control over, is slipping away. You're not going to get away with this. Not after everything you've done." The words hit him like a sledgehammer. He seemed to shrink in on himself, his eyes shifting between me and Emily, as though trying to find a way out. But there was no way out. There was no escape. The walls were closing in. "Please, I'll do anything," Jake begged, his voice rising with desperation. "Please, just tell me how to make it right. Please, I'm sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen." I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. "You never meant for it to happen, Jake." "That's the excuse you keep falling back on, but it's just that, an excuse. You knew exactly what you were doing when you slept with my wife. You knew exactly what you were doing when you planned to leave my family behind. Don't pretend like this was some accident." Jake's shoulders drooped, and I saw his resolve crumble further. He wasn't just broken. He was completely defeated. "Please," he whispered again, his voice weak. "I don't know how to fix this. Please." Emily's eyes softened for a brief moment, but her voice remained steady. "There's nothing to fix, Jake. You broke everything. You've ruined everything. And now you'll pay the price for it." Jake looked at us, pleading, his voice a fractured whisper. "What do you want from me? What can I do?" I leaned in, my face inches from his, and I spoke slowly, deliberately. "Nothing. You can do nothing. The damage is done. The game is over. You've lost." Jake stared at me, his eyes wide with disbelief, as if the reality of the situation hadn't quite sunk in yet. He had thought he could get away with this. He had thought he could manipulate Sarah, me, and even Emily. But he hadn't counted on us coming together, on Emily and me working in tandem. "You thought you could just tear this family apart and walk away, didn't you?" I asked, my voice low and dangerous. Jake didn't answer. He didn't need to. The truth was written all over his face. But I wasn't done. Not yet. I turned to Emily, and we shared a look that said everything. It was time to pull the final piece of the plan into place. "You're going to lose everything, Jake," I said, my voice cold as steel. Your career, your reputation, everything you've built, is about to go up in flames. And when it's all over, you'll have no one left. Jake's face drained of color. No, no, please. But there was no more mercy. Consider this your last warning, I said, walking out of the room, leaving him to absorb the full weight of what was coming for him. We were just getting started. The night after we confronted Jake felt surreal. The sense of power, the sense of control, was intoxicating. It was like I had finally stepped out of the shadows and into the light. Like all those years of living in a world of lies and deceit had been leading up to this moment. But as the adrenaline began to fade, a question lingered in my mind: what next? We had already taken the first steps, and the damage was done, but I knew it wasn't enough. Jake had been broken, yes, but he hadn't yet felt the full force of what we were capable of. And Sarah, well, she hadn't even begun to understand the depths of the betrayal she had caused. There was still so much more to do. As I lay awake that night, the weight of what I had started settled over me. There was no going back now. I had stepped into a new world, one where there were no rules, no boundaries, and where the consequences of actions were measured in devastation. The family I had once cherished, the life I had built, had already been shattered, and now it was time to watch everything else crumble. But my thoughts were interrupted by a call. It was Emily. Dad. Her voice crackled with something I couldn't place, a mix of tension and something else, something darker. Jake's been making calls. He's trying to fight back. I sat up, my heart rate quickening. What kind of calls? I don't know yet. But he's trying to pull some strings. I overheard him on the phone talking to someone about damage control, and I think he's trying to spin this into something that makes him look like the victim. I gripped the phone tighter. Jake wasn't just scared anymore. He was starting to think he could fix this. The problem with that? He was playing a game that had no rules. Find out who he's talking to. Let's see how far he's willing to go to cover up his mess. I already started, Emily replied, her voice sharp. I'm going to track down these people, find out exactly what he's planning. But be prepared, Dad. He's not just giving up. I hung up the phone, a sense of urgency washing over me. I knew Jake wouldn't just lie down. He was stubborn, arrogant, and he thought he could escape this mess with enough money and charm. But what he didn't realize was that he was up against me, and I wasn't going to let him weasel his way out. The next morning, I found myself in my office, staring at the same set of documents that had been lying untouched for weeks. The papers in front of me were a representation of everything I had built, the company, the house, the life. But now, they felt like they belonged to someone else. Someone who wasn't me. I'd spent years building that empire. It was mine. And no one, was going to take it away from me. But what Jake didn't know was that I had my own network of connections. People who owed me favors. People who could make things disappear. I picked up the phone, dialing a number I hadn't called in years. Hey, it's Mark, I said, my voice low. I need some help. The line crackled before the voice on the other end responded. Mark? What's this about? I've got a problem. A big one. And I need you to help me make it disappear. Disappearing problems, that's what I do best. What do you need? I explained the situation to my old contact, an insider with ties to the legal and financial world, someone who could erase the kind of mess Jake was trying to make. Within minutes, I had a plan. And within hours, I was in motion. Emily had already told me where Jake's main line of defense was, his connections in the corporate world. He was trying to leverage his family ties and his influence in business to save himself. But he didn't realize that his cards were already marked. I had made some calls of my own. And within days, Jake's entire support system would begin to unravel. I called Emily again. Get ready, I told her. We're going to make sure he regrets every single decision he's made. And that was when the real game began. Jake thought he could fight back. He thought that with a few well-placed lies and a couple of influential phone calls, he could repair the damage. But he had no idea that the moment he crossed me, he had signed his own death sentence. The next day, Jake's world started to come apart. I watched from the shadows as his carefully constructed web of lies began to fray at the edges. First, his business partners started to get cold feet. Some of his top clients began pulling away, citing ethical concerns and unresolved personal matters. Then came the legal threats. Lawyers began circling like sharks, demanding compensation for emotional distress caused by the scandal. One by one, the pieces fell into place. It wasn't long before Jake's reputation was in tatters. His career was spiraling downward at a speed that even I hadn't anticipated. He was no longer the confident, charming man he used to be. Now, he was a pariah, someone everyone was trying to distance themselves from. But Emily wasn't done. She had taken a more subtle approach. She had quietly begun reaching out to people who could bring Jake to his knees, people who had their own leverage over him. She was methodical, efficient, and cold. In the end, I realized she was every bit as ruthless as I was. The power dynamic between us had shifted in a way I hadn't expected. Emily had become my partner in this dark game, and together, we were making sure Jake paid for every single betrayal. But Sarah, she was still in the dark. She hadn't realized yet that her own world was about to crumble. And when it did, it would be a reckoning. "Dad, we're almost there," Emily told me one night. "Jake's on the edge. I've got everything lined up." "Good," I replied, my voice low. "Make sure he knows there's no escape." We were about to watch Jake's final fall, and I couldn't wait to see him break. The downfall of Jake had begun in full force. Every move he made seemed to compound his misery, and each piece of his life that he'd carefully crafted was slipping through his fingers, crumbling like sand. He thought he had influence. He thought he could control the narrative. But in the end, it wasn't his business connections or his manipulative charm that mattered. It was my network, and my will to destroy him. By the time Emily called me the next morning, I already knew things had reached their breaking point. "Dad," she said, her voice controlled, but with a quiet intensity that sent a jolt through me. "Jake's panicking. He tried to call me last night, begging for help. He's even talking about running away. But it's too late for him." I felt a sense of satisfaction wash over me. It's almost over, I thought. But there was one last piece of the puzzle I needed to put in place. "Good. Don't answer his calls," I said, my voice cool. "I'll handle him from here." Emily's silence spoke volumes. I could tell she was just as eager as I was to see this play out, but she also knew we were in the final stages. There was no turning back now. I spent the next several hours in meetings, dealing with things that could no longer wait. But all the while my mind was on Jake. On Sarah. On everything they had destroyed. By late afternoon, I received the call that would end it all. "Mark." The voice on the other end was familiar, an old friend who now worked in the legal world. "I've got something for you. It's not a simple solution, but it will get the job done." I raised an eyebrow. "What's the catch?" "The catch? There's no catch, just a bit of leverage. It's going to be expensive, but worth it. It'll make sure Jake's completely finished." A smile tugged at my lips. "Do it." I hung up the phone, my mind already spinning with the possibilities. I knew exactly how to use this. This was the final piece, the ultimate move. The last bit of leverage to completely annihilate Jake's reputation. Later that evening, I called Emily, and she could hear the resolve in my voice. "It's done," I said. "We've got everything we need. It's time to finish this." The next few hours were spent finalizing everything. Documents were signed, accounts transferred, and all the pieces that had been set in motion slowly clicked into place. It was methodical, deliberate. There was no room for error now. Jake's downfall was no longer a matter of personal vengeance. It had evolved into something much bigger. I was going to make sure he'd be unable to work, unable to show his face in public, unable to rebuild any part of the life he had so recklessly tried to destroy. The moment arrived sooner than I anticipated. Jake, unaware of the storm approaching, went on with his daily routine, trying to salvage what he could. But it didn't take long for him to realize that his world had been completely turned upside down. It started with his phone buzzing nonstop. He checked the screen, and I saw the color drain from his face as he read the messages. His face twisted in confusion, and then disbelief. "Mark," he stammered, his voice breaking. "What did you do?" I didn't say anything right away. I let him stew in his panic. I wanted him to feel the weight of his choices. "You don't get to ask me that, Jake," I finally replied, my voice like ice. "You've done enough to ruin me. Now it's your turn to feel the consequences." The door to his office slammed open. Emily entered, her face cold and unreadable, as always. She didn't even spare him a glance as she walked toward the desk where Jake stood, utterly broken. "You tried to fight back," she said softly, as if talking to a child who had failed. "But you didn't realize you were already done." Jake's eyes flicked between the two of us, a glimmer of recognition in his face as it all started to click. But it was too late. He had no idea how deep the hole had become. Emily placed a stack of documents on the desk in front of him, each one sealed and stamped with the kind of authority Jake couldn't argue with. "You were too confident, Jake," she continued, her voice steady, her gaze unflinching. "You thought you could buy your way out. You thought you could lie your way out. But you're not as powerful as you think you are." I stepped closer, watching as the panic spread across Jake's face. "You thought you could control everything. You thought you could control Sarah, me, and even Emily. But you never understood that you were never in control. I was always 5 steps ahead." I watched him as he crumbled, his knees buckling as he realized that his entire empire, everything he had fought for, everything he had banked on, was gone. The lawsuit came down first. His personal finances were frozen. His business dealings were exposed. And the final blow, the one he hadn't seen coming, was the article that would make sure his name would never again be associated with success. The article detailing his betrayal, his lies, and the fraud he had committed to manipulate his way into the family's wealth. It was out there for the world to see now. And it was done. Jake had nothing left. But Sarah? Sarah still didn't know what was coming. She had been so wrapped up in her own pain, in her own guilt, that she hadn't seen the storm approaching. And when the truth came crashing down on her, she wouldn't just lose Jake, she would lose everything. "I think it's time we tell Sarah," I said, turning to Emily. Emily's eyes glittered with a cold, sharp light. "She's going to be devastated." I smiled thinly. "She's going to deserve every moment of it." And with that, the final chapter of our plan began to unfold. The calm before the storm is always the most deceptive. I felt it in my bones, the stillness of everything coming together. The destruction was so complete now, so final, that I couldn't help but savor the impending collapse. But the last step, the most crucial step, was yet to come. It had to be done carefully, precisely. Sarah still didn't know what her husband had done, what she had done. I called Emily early the next morning. There was a quiet determination in her voice as she answered. "It's time," she said. I paused for a moment. "We can't rush this. We need to be methodical." "I know," she replied. "I'll make sure she's home when we do it. It has to come from us. She's already been lied to enough." I agreed. Sarah had been deceived by everyone around her, her own daughter, her husband, me. And now, she was going to face the harshest truth of all. Later that afternoon, I found myself sitting in the living room of our family home, the place where I'd spent years trying to keep things together. It felt so different now. The air, the furniture, the very walls seemed to hold the weight of the deceit and the collapse that had been brewing. Emily entered, her face expressionless but her eyes sharp with the same cold resolve that had been driving her. Sarah followed behind her, looking at us both with curiosity, but also a sense of unease. She had no idea what was coming. "Mom," Emily said, her voice calm but laced with an undercurrent of something darker. "We need to talk." Sarah's eyes flickered between us. She could feel the tension, the shift in the room. But she had no idea what was about to hit her. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice wavering just slightly. I stood up, walking slowly toward her. My voice, when I spoke, was colder than I had ever heard it before. "What's going on, Sarah? Is that your world is about to shatter?" The words hung in the air between us like a heavy fog. Sarah took a step back, her face pale, her hands trembling. "What do you mean? What's happening?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I turned to Emily. She held up her phone, and before Sarah could react, she pressed play on a video. The video showed Sarah and Jake, captured from a distance, in a series of private moments. The earlier recordings of their conversations, the whispered plans, the lies they told to cover their tracks. Sarah's face twisted in disbelief as she watched, her hands shaking as she recognized her own voice, her own words, in those conversations. "No," Sarah whispered, her eyes darting between Emily and me, searching for an explanation, but finding none. "Yes," I said. "You've been living in a lie, Sarah. A lie that your husband has been feeding you for years. But he wasn't just lying to you, he was lying to me. And to Emily. He was using us all to build his own empire. But we've already taken care of it." Sarah stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing, as if she was struggling to find the right words. The video continued to play, showing her husband, Jake, being exposed for what he was, a manipulator, a liar, and a cheat. The recordings of his conversations, the details of his plans to destroy everything we had, played out in full. "No," Sarah said again, this time louder, as the full weight of the betrayal crashed down on her. Jake wouldn't. He wouldn't do this." "He did," Emily said quietly, her voice cutting through the air. "And the worst part? He thought he could get away with it. He thought he could make a fool out of both of you, while we were left picking up the pieces." Sarah collapsed into the nearest chair, her face a mask of shock, disbelief, and pure devastation. "I don't understand. How could he do this? How could he betray me like this?" I stepped forward, my voice unwavering. "He wasn't just betraying you. He was betraying all of us. And now, it's all over. He's lost everything." I watched as the reality began to sink in. Sarah's breath quickened, her chest heaving with the realization that she had been a pawn in a game she didn't even know existed. "Emily, I'm so sorry," Sarah choked out, her voice trembling. "I had no idea. I had no idea that he was capable of something like this." Emily didn't flinch, but there was a subtle shift in her expression, something that softened just for a moment. "I know you didn't, Mom. But you should have seen it. The signs were always there, and now everything is falling apart." The weight of the moment hung in the air. I could see the devastation in Sarah's eyes, the confusion, the hurt. She had no one left to turn to. Her husband had betrayed her. Her daughter had been forced into this war. And now, it was her turn to face the consequences. "But why?" Sarah whispered. "Why didn't you tell me? Why let me live in the dark?" I looked at her, my gaze piercing and unforgiving. "Because, Sarah, you didn't want to know the truth. And sometimes the truth is too ugly to face. But now you have no choice." I turned to Emily. "We've done what we needed to do. It's over." Sarah sat motionless, her tears silently staining her cheeks. She couldn't even bring herself to look at us anymore. She had no answers, no justification for what had happened. She was left with nothing but the wreckage of her life, a life that had been manipulated by the very people she loved the most. "Take care of yourself, Sarah," I said coldly. "The world doesn't wait for people who refuse to see the truth." I turned to leave the room, but not before I caught one last look at the broken woman who had once been so much more. This was the price of betrayal. And this was the end game. It had all come down to this moment. The pieces were in place, the plan executed, and the consequences were playing out exactly as I predicted. Jake was gone, his career dismantled, his lies exposed for the world to see. Sarah, broken and confused, now faced a reality she couldn't escape from. But there was one last, lingering question that I hadn't yet answered: what happens after the fall? I could have walked away. I had won. I had taken everything from them. But as the days passed, something gnawed at me, an unsettling feeling in the pit of my stomach. Maybe it was the cold satisfaction of seeing Jake lose everything, his wealth, his reputation, his family. Or maybe it was the haunting realization that no matter what I did, nothing could bring back what I had lost. That night, Emily came to me again, her face grim as she stepped into my study. "Dad, there's something you need to see." Her voice was tight, and I could tell she wasn't just talking about the aftermath of the plan. It was something more. I followed her into the living room, my heart pounding in anticipation of what she might show me. On the screen in front of me was a news article. It wasn't the usual business report or local scandal. No, this was something far worse. Family betrayal, wife and daughter's involvement in husband's downfall revealed. My heart sank. I leaned closer, my eyes scanning the article as a pit formed in my stomach. Emily and I had been so careful, so precise in executing our plan. But we hadn't anticipated the final twist, the way the story was now being spun by the media. The article was framed as if it were a tragedy, a tale of a wronged husband whose family had turned on him. The headline made it seem like I had been the orchestrator of a ruthless revenge plot, but not for the reasons everyone thought. The story claimed that Jake had been misled by both his wife and his daughter, who had apparently manipulated events to ruin his life. The press painted Emily and me as cold, calculating masterminds who had destroyed a man just to satisfy our own selfish need for revenge. I sat back, the weight of it all crashing down on me. I had spent so long planning every detail, making sure there was no trace of our involvement. But someone had slipped up. Someone had leaked the story, and now it was a matter of public perception. The people who once saw me as a respectable businessman now viewed me as a villain, a man who had turned his family into pawns in a personal vendetta. "Who did this?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Emily's face was taut with anger. "I don't know yet. But I'm going to find out. This isn't over." But deep down I knew. The moment we set everything in motion, we'd created a new enemy. Someone who was willing to watch us burn. Someone who had access to the truth and was using it against us. The worst part? It didn't matter what the truth was anymore. All that mattered was the story the world believed. And right now, the world believed that I had destroyed my own family for revenge. I spent the next several days in damage control, trying to salvage whatever I could from the mess that had been made. I reached out to old contacts, tried to repair the damage to my reputation. But every step I took seemed to make things worse. The media was relentless, and the more I tried to control the narrative, the more the story evolved into something even darker. And then I realized, it was never about revenge. Not for Jake. Not for Sarah. Not even for Emily and me. The story that had unfolded, the one we had carefully crafted and set in motion, was not the one we had intended to tell. We had destroyed Jake, yes. We had shattered everything he had built, taken everything he had taken from us. But in doing so, we had unleashed a far greater monster, the monster of public perception. And there was no escaping that. As I sat in my office, surrounded by the crumbling remnants of everything I had worked for, I came to a horrifying realization. The lies, the deception, the betrayal, it had all been for nothing. We had destroyed Jake, but in the process, we had destroyed ourselves. I looked at Emily one final time. Her face was still resolute, but I could see the weariness in her eyes. "Is it worth it?" I asked, the question hanging in the air like a final plea for understanding. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked at me, her eyes cold and distant. "We had no choice, Dad. We had to do it. But we've lost everything," I whispered. "The truth doesn't matter anymore. We've become the villains in our own story." Emily's gaze softened for a brief moment before she turned away. "Maybe. But at least we're still standing." I couldn't bring myself to answer her. The truth was that nothing mattered anymore. Jake was gone. Sarah was broken. Emily and I were left in the ruins of our own making. And the world would never know the truth. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about survival. And now, we had to live with the consequences of the choices we had made. The world might have thought they knew our story, but they didn't understand the cost of it. They didn't see the pieces that were left behind, the lives that had been destroyed, the family that had been torn apart. And so, we moved forward, our fates sealed by the decisions we had made. Jake was gone, but the damage was done. There was no redemption. No way to undo what had been done. We had won, but at what cost?